So my name is Maitreya Bandu and I'm talking to you from the main shrine room of the London Buddhist Centre in the UK. A while ago I had this wonderful conversation with the poet Jee Leong Koh, a Singaporean poet living in New York, and in this film you've got some of his responses to the questions I asked him, and of course some of his wonderful poems, especially from his most recent Carcanet collection, Inspector, Inspector. We talked about so many things. Here's some of the things that we want to share with you. I hope you enjoy it. So welcome everyone to Poetry East. I'm really delighted to be in conversation with Jee Leong Koh and his 3 books of poems that I've really enjoyed and that I want to introduce you to. So welcome, Jee. Really, really nice to have you here. Very nice to see you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And you're tuning in, aren't you? You're in New York at the moment.
Yes, that's right. It is actually Wednesday morning right now.
Right. So thank you very much indeed for. I always want to say coming on the show. It's not a show. Here I am. I'm tuning in from the London Buddhist Centre, as you can see. Sometimes people think it's a green screen behind me, but this is actually the London Buddhist Centre. So very nice to have you here, even if it's just virtually. Jee, really, really good. I was hoping that we'd be able to do one in person because you've recently visited the UK, but we didn't manage to quite find the dates that match. So I first came upon your poetry. I first came upon this book, the Pillow Book. I read a selection from the Pillow Book in PM Review, Carcanet's magazine, who published your 2 collections, at least in the UK. I know you've got more collections than that, but they published your 2 UK collections. And I was actually, another poet recommended me. She said, "Oh, the best thing in PM Review this month is this Pillow Book. Have you read it?" And I didn't even know then what a Pillow Book was. And I hadn't heard of you, Jee. And then I immediately read them and was completely delighted by them. So I thought we'd just jump straight in with a poem from that, and then I'll talk to you a bit more about that. So I thought we could start, if you would, asking you to read Mount Faber is a Misnomer. And let's see where we go from there.
Yes, sure. It's always delightful to read from the Pillow Book. I think I have the original edition, whereas you actually are holding on to the bilingual English and English and Japanese edition with the illustrations, which is lovely. So I'm going to read one of the many sections of this slim volume, really. And this is a section called Mount Faber is a Misnomer. Mount Faber is a misnomer for the hill by which I grew up. It is not even the tallest hill in Singapore. I don't know who Faber is, but the word has always sounded delightfully like fable. I went to a very small school on the hill. Radin Mas Primary School consisted of 2 distinct parts, the lower grades at the beginning of a long flight of stairs, the upper grades at the end. It was enough to teach one about large ambition and little achievement. About the efflorescence of Singapore poetry in the last 2 decades, the critic Gwee Sui is right. It is not the result of cultural change, certainly not because of government programs. It has sprung up like wildflowers on a hillside, and it may die without altering the landscape. The best of us still aim to be major generals of a reserve army, pioneers of second-rate products, prime ministers of an island. The dreamier turn to poetry. On every visit to Singapore, I make it a point of what? To walk up Mount Faber, going by the road that winds Toyotas and tour buses up. From the top, I see on one side the public housing estates, intricate and useful, and on the other the featureless sea, caught by the hand of the hill, as if thrown there by a storm, lodges a boat. To the hungry eye, it is a seafood restaurant. To the hungrier eye, it is an ark. I look at the sea again, and now I see the ships on the morph horizon. I recite quietly a tanka composed a while ago. Because this country has no mountains, we think highly of hills. Look, we point to the peaks where we can live.
That's great. Thank you, Jee. I really, I mean, I must say right from the start that I've chosen the select. I've been cheeky enough to sort of choose a selection of poems, but I thought this is a lovely one to start off because it takes us right back to your native Singapore and you being born and raised in Singapore. I wondered, I thought it would be lovely to say a little bit about the Pillar Book generally, why compose a Pillar Book, and a little bit about, because we're going to be following your life in Singapore quite a lot through the poems to the final poem that we've selected. I wonder whether you might say a little bit about the world you come from, because many people won't know that world, at least not very well. So it'd be good to hear more about that.
Yes, the Pillow Book, of course, is famously written by the 10th, 11th century Japanese court lady Sei Shonagon, all right, in Japan, and that is reckoned, by scholars to be one of the first, if not the first, examples of a genre called the Zuihitsu. Now, the Zuihitsu, if you translate it from Japanese, means to actually draw spontaneously, right, with the brush. And that is exactly the qualities I so admire in this essayistic form, because this form prizes a kind of spontaneity of expression. And I actually learned about this form from the Japanese German American poet Kimiko Han in New York City, when I actually studied with her in a workshop on Japanese forms, and really, really felt that this was a form that was very suitable for a certain kind of tone, especially something that's playful, something that's sparkly, but at the same time also observant and acute and perceptive. At least that is the hope. So I turned yeah, so I turned the gaze of the poem on my upbringing in Singapore. And I have just read, of course, the section about Mount Faber, which is actually the hill beside where my parents still live, my mom, right? My dad passed away 4 years ago, and where I actually grew up. So, growing up beside a hill, it has never really left my consciousness. It has always been there. We would go up, walk up once in a while when we were young. But certainly now when I visit Singapore every year in the summer, I would make it a point to, walk up or run if I can to the top of the hill. And of course, I think we are very familiar with the idea that hills in East Asian cultures, mountains and hills in East Asian cultures are sacred places, right? They are places where spirits reside, where hermits retreat to. And we can see why they have acquired a spiritual aura. So what I love too about, this Zuihitsu is that even though it's such a secular form, it is also, I believe, kind of deeply spiritual. And I hope that comes across too in my Pillow Book. Yeah.
I mean, what struck me about it when I first read it is, it's got a sort of sweetness all the way through it. We'll come to some of the love poems part of it, but it's got this lovely kind of gentleness and sweetness, and as you say, a sort of casual tone that belies the depth underneath it. It reminded me a bit of a haibung, the Japanese, again another Japanese form with that slightly like it's a letter. It appears to be casual, almost throwaway, but it's got these kind of hidden depths. It's got that sort of feel to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go on.
Yes, I was just going to respond by saying I think you're absolutely right about the casualness of it, isn't it? Because I think the modern form that is probably most closely associated with the Zuihitsu is the diary, right?
Yeah.
It has a casual spontaneity of a diary entry. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I'm going to ask you more about Singapore in a while, but I wanted to move to another poem of this section because I think it introduces one of the themes that anyone would see and I see in your work, which is the theme of love and loss. In some ways, and we'll be touching on this more later, in some ways you're a love poet, in a particular way, a kind of almost sweet and sour way. But I thought we'd hear this lovely section when someone comes home with me. I remember when I first read this in PN Review, I just got one of those little shocks you get when you read a good poem where you think, oh, that's lovely, you know.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, I will read it for you. When someone comes home with me. When someone comes home with me, there is always the question of how I will ask him to leave. If the man has a good year, he does not need any cue, but leaves at a natural pause in the rhythm of the meeting. If he asks to stay the night, I give in. I bring him out for breakfast in the morning at the Irish diner, now manned by Mexicans, so that he can hear the train.
I just really like that mixture of humour and tenderness in that very, very short. They're sort of short prose paragraphs in a way, aren't they? But I wonder, whether we'll be coming to this a bit later. But can you say more about what it was like, or something about what it was like growing up in Singapore as a gay man? This is one of the themes that echoes through the work. And this for me is a very New York poem. A lot of the poems that I've really loved they're sort of Singapore refracted through New York, or seen from Brooklyn Bridge almost, seen from another life. You've led, it seems to me, at least 3 lives, one in Singapore, one in England, and one in New York. But yeah, I thought perhaps you might start to tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in Singapore from that perspective.
Yes, certainly. I mean, I could never have written these books, these poems, if I had not left Singapore. That is very, very clear to me. Because when I was growing up in Singapore, I really could not admit to myself that I was gay. It was supposedly a shameful thing to be. And I was a teacher, all right, in a secondary school in Singapore. So that makes it even more fraught because, made it even more fraught because I would imagine what if I am out and about, and I bump into somebody who would recognize me and who would expose me. All right. Not only would that be shameful, I could even actually lose my job. All right. Because after all, I have become one of those infamous corrupter of the youth, as Socrates was known to be. So I was terrified, to be frank. I mean, that my experience, of course, was not the same as many other Singaporean poets who are gay, who actually remain in Singapore, but that was not a choice I could make. And so it was really by leaving Singapore and going to New York that I actually come out as a gay man. But the other aspect of it, which is very interesting, of course, is that, Singapore is a very busy place. Everybody worked really, really hard. And so did I when I was teaching. I would leave my home at 6:30 a.m. and return home every night at 9 p.m. in order to get all the work done. So there was really no time for writing. And so I had to actually give myself the permission, to move away from Singapore, enrolled myself in a 2-year MFA program in creative writing, and give myself the gift of time of reading and writing to see whether I was any good as a poet, so to speak.
And how old were you when you did that?
Oh, I wish now I had left much earlier, because I left Singapore at a ripe old age of 33.
So I want to talk more about you leaving Singapore soon. Although it's interesting because in the poems you have left and sort of not left as well, because one never leaves one homeland in a certain sense, and they haunt the poems very, very, very beautifully. But let's hear one more from. I'd like to hear many more from the Pillar Book. In a way, it would be worth hearing them all. So they're a lovely sequence with these lovely illustrations as well. But let's hear. I think it's the last one, nearly the last one, the penultimate poem, "All Things." Which again is a lovely short poem from the Pillar Book.
I wrote this section, All Things, in fact, in Kimiko Han's workshop. And so, it was really one of the very first sections of the Pillow Book, even though in the final organization, it comes near the end. All things. All things diminish as they grow older. A friend of many years said last week, even the expanding universe must contract. This morning, as I'm boiling water to make coffee, his words come back to me, as sure as before, but smaller, because the whistling of the kettle takes up space. The steam was not so long ago, a patch of snow. Love is what life boils into.
Thank you very much. Can you say a little bit? I'm very struck, of course, by that last line. I love the use of the kettle. I really like your use of very small particulars like that and finding a metaphor to connect them to something vital. Do you know what you meant by "love is what life boils into"?
I have some idea, but I would love to hear yours too. I think having been brought up on the English tradition of poetry, very often romantic love at least is formulated, is conceived as a kind of passion, right, with a great deal of intensity. And that is partly, I think, what I mean by life boiling into love, right? Because yes, love might be as insubstantial and ephemeral as steam, but boy, is it hot! Boy, can it hurt! You can get scalded by steam. So there's a kind of like a heating, evaporation of life, leaving behind all this dross into something purer but more fiery. Now that is a tradition that I know from English poetry, I think. But what is really fun for me is to put it in this casual way in this Zuhitsu. So I can say something intense in a very non-intense way. And I love that tension, right, between the form and the content.
That's one of the things I've really enjoyed about your work is the capacity to say something intense in a non-intense way, like you put it. I mean, I wondered whether Larkin was behind this section a bit. It reminds me of what is it? All that's left of us is love from the Arundel Tomb or something like that. How much has English poetry been behind some of your writing?
Yes, definitely. I love Larkin. I read him, intensely when I was growing up. Certainly, some of these ideas I think, can be found in him too, and perhaps even just a syntax as well, right? Love is what life boils into. I cannot remember now, but I'm sure there's a Larkin poem that ends with a preposition. And that's a very special way of, playing with the sentence structure. But the other poet, of course, who is so diametrically in opposite of Larkin that I used to love was T.S. Eliot. So I've always kind of like thought of myself as kind of like loving two very very different poets, Eliot and Larkin. But since then, of course, I think having moved from Singapore to New York, I've actually sought for other models in poets who have also moved away from their original country. So I love W.H. Auden, right, who of course moved to New York as well, and also Tom Gunn, who moved to San Francisco. No surprise, of course, that these two were gay poets, And these two poets are also poets who are very concerned with poetic form. But beyond technique and beyond form, it is their lives and the examples that they uh, set as poets that I find so intriguing and so inspiring.
Tom Gunn, they've just released a wonderful volume of his letters. I don't know whether you're aware of it. There's a new wonderful volume of Tom Gunn's letters. I mean, tremendous poet. And yeah, you see moments of Auden all the way through, I think, your writing. But let's go to Steep Tea, which is your first Carcanet collection. I wonder whether you could just say a little bit about how we ended up with Steep Tea. How did we end up? How did you end up? Because you came to England, didn't you? You studied at Oxford. Perhaps tell us a little bit about that journey from Singapore to England. Yeah.
Yeah, I very much came from a working class family, so I could not have found my way by myself, to England. Fortunately, I was very good at school, and so I won a government teaching scholarship to study at Oxford, where I read English and had a great time. 3 years of absolute freedom before going back, to Singapore to fulfill my teaching bond, the obligation that the government put on me. Oxford was strange. On the one hand, as I said, it was really liberating to be living away from home, to be making, you know, um, trying to live one's own life, away from family for the first time. At the same time, at that time, I was a very fundamentalist evangelical Christian, and I was convinced at that time that I knew the answers to the mysteries of the universe. But because I had a good book, right? All the answers can be found in a good book, even if I did not understand them, at that moment. And I think, unfortunately, that had the effect of, restricting, limiting my intellectual inquiry while I was at Oxford, because I would write these essays for my English tutor, and they would be, kind of orthodox or maybe unorthodox, depending whether believe in Christian orthodoxy. And I really felt, on looking back, that I could have given myself much more room to actually explore intellectually, spiritually, and sexually too. Because of course, throughout those 3 years, I was crushing on a lot of people, but had no means of expressing those feelings.
And what made you? Do you feel that you lost your faith, or has it changed? What happens there? Just to carry on that story a moment.
Yes, I would say, after, graduating from Oxford, returning to England, I was unfortunately in a very homophobic church in Singapore. So certainly that was one part of the reason why I left the church. And I believe institutionalized religion in general. But of course, what I've discovered in my writing is that there is still that spiritual quest. It is not in religious institutions or organized religion, but I really do believe, that life must obviously be much, much more than the economic and the material. I do not believe in supernatural beings. Nevertheless, I believe we are, more than ourselves, right? More than our bodies, so to speak. Whatever we choose to call it, the soul or the spirit. I think that's very important to me too.
I think we'd have a lot in common in that way, Jee. We've got a lot in common in lots of ways, but that would be one of the ways we've got things in common. But let's have a look at Steve. Oh yes, you were going to say, how did you approach Carcanet? What was the relationship with Michael Schmidt there at Carcanet?
I submitted poems to PN Review, as many people do, were rejected a bunch of times. And finally, Michael wrote to me and says, I would like to publish, these one or two poems, but you have others. and I sent him, some more poems, and he started publishing me in PN Review because I think he prefers to publish a group of poems, believing, of course, that it shows something of the range of the writer instead of just one poem per poet.
Yes, yeah.
And so I think I must have published in PN Review twice or three times maybe before I was invited to contribute to the new PoetryEast anthology, all right, which is of course put out by Carcanet. And really that is kind of like for Carcanet kind of a launch pad, once you're included in that anthology, they're very likely, although it's not a sure thing, to put out your first collection with them. So that was my with Carcanet.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's hear this poem for Lust. It's interesting, after talking there about spirituality and something beyond us and coming out as gay and so on. Let's go all the way to Lust. There's quite a lot of lust.
My favorite topic.
It's your hot topic. It's your boiling kettle. So I love this poem. Let's hear. And you've got this dedication. Perhaps say a bit about that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For Lust was written after I began a long-term at the very beginning of a long-term relationship, basically. So that was a change in my life, right? From being on my own to being with someone else. It has an epigraph actually from the English poet Ruth Pitter, who wrote in the poem "But for Lust," but for lust, we could be friends. So for her, of course, lust came in between the friendship, right? And so I took up that theme in my poem. For lust. I want to call you back, but do not think I should. I am in love now, you see. And love must exclude its lookalikes, its foreign gods, its counterproof. He is so good to me, and when I am not good, he calmly rubs away what in my soul is rough. Approve may rhyme with love, but so does disapprove. But oh, the nights of passion you and I had shared, the bearing of the places that we thought were bared, reslotting what was present into what was past, no holes barred, no forbidden gestures, nothing spared. I will not call you back, although I feel I must. Trust rhymes with lust, but my desire, so does distrust.
That's great. And it's got such a strong formal nature to it. Sort of goes back to people like John Donne, but yeah, an echo of Auden's formal strength. Is it that seems to be part of your concern, the formal concerns? Would you say?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, as in this poem, it is really the speaker, feeling, you want to call up, this other person that, that you still have desire for, but telling himself not to do so. So the speaker is actually restraining himself, all right, from doing what he really wants to do. And that's what form does, isn't it? Form acts as a kind of restraint. It does not restrain, does not constrain expression. Instead, it actually increases intensity. Because, when something is, held back, we feel, of course, the resistance, right, of the original force. So for me, form very often has that effect, that it can make something even more intense because it's holding back what is already very intense. And in this particular poem, of course, I love to play with, the rhymes, the fact that trust and mistrust both rhymes with lust. I mean, tells us, isn't it, about our ambivalence towards it, right? That we both want it and do not want it.
Again, also, it's a very good example of how form in poetry is an expression of content. I thought how you explained it there was really was like a little essay on that. The poem itself is about somebody restraining themselves, and the form actually restrains you. So we get this lovely crossing over of form and content, which is what always form is about, I think, in poetry. It's a deepening of content, isn't it?
Absolutely. I love the expression, a thickening of content. Yes, that too.
So let's look at another one from Steve to T. One of the things you're doing in this collection, one of the main things you're doing in this collection is taking as your sort of, and that's true of this for Lust as well, taking as your sort of jumping off point the writing of other poets, particularly female poets. Can you say a little bit about that, and then let's read this wonderful poem, In His Other House, which is, I can never quite remember how to pronounce her name, Elaine Nikliakian, I think. I've been in conversation with her, and she's a poet I very, very much admire, a very, very strong voice and a remarkable voice, I think. So perhaps say something about that project, about responding to women's voices, particularly in poetry, and how that then creates a poem for you.
Yeah, I mean, it all began, I think, with my reading Evan Boland, the Irish poet. Yeah, because as I was reading her collected poems, I felt a strong urge, strong need to respond to her poems with poems of my own. All right, so instead of just writing down analytical notes, I really wanted to respond poetically. And I might have been influenced in this by Elaine's is it Scarry, wonderful book on beauty, when she distinguishes between two kinds of beauty, isn't it? There's a kind of beauty, right, that makes you feel as if, okay, it's already done, right? It's already perfect. I cannot do anything to add to it, so it makes you stop working. But there is also another kind of beauty that when you encounter is generative. You feel as if you want to say something about it, you want to add something to it. Or not because it is lacking or imperfect, but because it is reproductive. You want to produce something. It gets its effect on the beholder. And certainly that was my experience when I was reading Evan Boland. I felt as if, the beauty of her verse makes me want to actually write poems in response to her. And after, reading her collected and having written a bunch of these poems, I realized how few women poets I knew well. I mean, when I was talking about, the British poets, who have influenced me, you would have noticed immediately, they were all men, many of them were gay. I really, really felt, this gap in my knowledge very sorely. So I began this project of basically reading as many women poets as I can. Trying to find in their experience something both different from mine, but at the same time it's similar as well. So I came upon this idea of using of quoting them as an epigraph, to all the poems in Steve T. Sometimes, of course, as a kind of a launch pad. Sometimes, as just a starting point, from which I digress, but sometimes also in opposition. So I do have a poem in Steve which actually quotes from a poem by Mary Oliver called Singapore. I like a lot of Mary Oliver's poetry, but I still think it is very unfortunate that she wrote this poem called Singapore, and so I responded to it in opposition. But whether really, in sympathy or in opposition, I think women poets are tremendously generative, to read and to think about.
I mean, it's interesting that because it reminds me, it sounds a bit highfalutin, but it reminds me of a book by George Steiner called Real Presences. One of his points is that the best criticism is another work of art. That every work of art is a criticism of works of art, and like you say, like a response, like an opposition, like a starting place for another work of art. And he was saying that's the best kind of criticism. That's the kind of criticism we should most have,
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that's a great idea and saying, isn't it? And that's the kind of criticism I would like too. To be able to, if my work, my poems produce other poems that are in dialogue with mine, I think that's tremendous.
So let's hear this one, In His Other House.
Sure. in his other house. In my other house, too, books fill the floor-to-ceiling shelves. Not only books on stock markets, seven habits, ghost stories, but also poetry. Arthur Yap, Cyril Wong, Alfian Sa'at, and one who moved away and who wrote Days of No Name. My father comes home from the power station. When rested, and this is how I know this is not real, he reads to us again, for the seventh time, Philip Jeyaretnam's Abraham's Promise, in a quiet voice, unbroken by a frightened young supervisor. When he closes the book, my dead grandfather stirs heavily and says a word or two that really says he has been listening. And my beloved, knowing his cue, jumps up from the couch to clear the dishes, for he says dishes don't wash themselves. Softly brightened by a feeling I do not hurry to identify, I move to the back of him and put my arms around his waist. His muscles twitch like the needle on a motorboat's dashboard as he turns a bone china plate against the rough cotton cloth. The light from the window looks like a huge blank sea. In this other house there will be time to fill it. But right now the bell intones in silver, and here on a surprise night visit are my sister and her two daughters coming through the door.
That's great. Thank you very much. This seems like this could be written as a prologue to your new collection, Inspector, Inspector, almost. The reference back to your father, the sense. We'll be finishing with this lovely final poem in Inspector, Inspector, the reply, which I think is one of your major poems, if I may say so. But I love this. In that poem, there's this sort of wanting to sort of value and to respect and even gain the blessings of parents and grandparents and so on. And this lovely, the erotic theme in it, I really like jumping up for the couch to clear the dishes, for he says dishes don't wash themselves. It's that sort of very, very natural English idiom that somehow in your voice sounds slightly comic and touching at the same time. Perhaps say something a bit about, does your father work, did he work at a power station? Who's your grandfather? Can you introduce this part of your life, sort of thing, from this?
No, I think it's fascinating that you said that this poem could have formed the preface to Inspector Inspector, because you're right. I didn't think of that. I mean, obviously some of these themes, are always percolating in my mind and they come back again and again, don't they? I mean, in the Pillow Book section that I read about Mount Faber, I talk about Singapore poetry, right? And here in other house, I too refer to the place of poetry, right, in Singapore. But of course, in his other house, imagines an alternative history for Singapore, right? A history in which a gay household is the norm, all right, is not abnormal. Where small little domestic details like dishwashing, who washes up, is the biggest quarrel there is in the family, right? But I think you're right that threading through all these books is an attempt to find some kind of lineage, a paternal lineage, through my father, and then through him to my grandfather. Because in my case, it has to be an alternative scenario because I don't actually find that lineage, all right, in my own life. The reason being, my grandfather actually left his family when his children were still in school for another family that he had, And so my father and my uncles and aunties were, you know, perhaps justifiably really angry with their father, right? So much so that when my grandfather actually became frail and needed, to be looked after, nobody among my father's brothers and sisters were willing to take him in, right? Because this was a father who abandoned them, right? And I have always admired my father to be the one in his family to have taken in my grandfather. And that is not because we were well off. We were living in a two-bedroom apartment in Singapore, which was kind of average, maybe slightly below average, which meant, of course, my parents would take one of the bedrooms. My bedroom was given over to my grandfather, right? My sister would, sleep with my parents, and I get to sleep on the mattress in the living room, right? So I felt as if I was kind of turfed out of my own bedroom by my grandfather. So it was a very cramped situation, but cramped not just physically, but also emotionally and psychologically, because my grandfather and my father never really resolved the issue between them. I mean, they hardly spoke to one another except, about meals and the most practical matters. And that was the way it was, right, to the end of my grandfather's life. Uh, and so it was a kind of, as I said, a kind of broken, lineage that I tried to, I guess, reimagine and maybe even perhaps, poetically restore in some way by finding other, paternal lineages in one way or
Well, that's a very striking and moving sort of story. I mean, it's not a story for you; it's your life. But the sense of your father in the, we'll turn now to Inspector, because your father and your father's death, and trying to give your father a voice, perhaps a voice that one imagines that he couldn't have, or a sense of his decency and kindness, to me, comes through the poems very strongly. Slightly remote, perhaps, but sort of decent. So perhaps say a little bit about your father's presence in Inspector. Is by far the largest presence. There's still this erotic, very strongly erotic. There's a lovely. We'll come and hear one of them. It's a shame we couldn't hear all of them, but there's a very strong erotic theme running through a sequence of poems. There's a historical theme about people living who've migrated, who've come from Singapore. We'll hear one of those. But a sort of dominant theme is your father's presence in the collection.
Yeah, that's
So I
absolutely
wonder whether you
right.
sort of, yeah,
Yeah. I
perhaps
mean,
perhaps some more about him.
yes, I lost my father. My father died 4 years ago now. And before that, for like, you know, um, 1 or 2 years, he has been suffering from COPD, which basically, means that his lungs were collapsing because he was a heavy smoker, right? And because of the lungs collapse, his heart was actually laboring, to work, and his body was retaining a lot of fluid. And so because of his swollen legs, right, he could not move around very easily and very soon had to be, wheelchair bound. And some of that details, unpleasant details actually became the imagery in the poems about him. All right, the imagery of flooding, collapse, so forth, and being unable to walk, um, because it must be so very emasculating for a very active man, all right, to be
Yeah.
reduced to such a condition. And I really did not know how to approach the topic because my memories of my father were very few, and memories of what he said were even fewer. As you said, he was a very kind, decent man, but he was also a very remote man. who did not express his feelings very openly. And it was only when I came upon this poetic form called the palinode, which I found in another woman poet. This time it is the Asian American poet Monique, Monica Yuen, who used the form of palinode uh, to write about her own concern. And the palinode is actually not so much a poem as a kind of gesture, right? Basically, it is a poem in which the speaker retracts a statement that he made in an earlier poem. So it is a poem of retraction, is perhaps a poem of regret. And rightly or wrongly, I have projected that strong sense of regret into my father's life. And so in Inspector, my new book, a series of 13 palinodes thread their way through the whole book. And in these palinodes, basically, I give my dead father his voice back, so to speak, if only to hear him retract something that he might or might not have said in life.
There's a very, very striking presence in the collection, the new collection. But before we get to it, I want to sort of explore some of it, because I want to finish with this wonderful poem of yours, The Reply, which is what you conclude this collection. And but before that, I thought we'd start with Gaudy Boy. This is a piece that's sort of almost begging to be anthologized, I think. I get you to read that, and let's see what you want to say about that as we say.
Sure, I will read from Inspector now. And the Gaudy Boy actually is a phrase used in a poem by a Singaporean poet, Arthur Yap, who I see as a predecessor or as a father figure, all right, in his own way. He also went to the UK to study. In his case, he spent a year in Leeds in the UK doing his master's in linguistics. And he too was gay. And he wrote, several poems while he was in Leeds that are very, very much more open about his gay, sexuality than, the poems that he wrote in Singapore. So, going abroad obviously has this kind of liberating effect on different poets. Yeah.
Of course.
So this, this phrase Gaudy Boy is taken from Arthur Yap's poem Gaudy Turnout, and it is a cruising poem. That's how I read it anyway. So Arthur Yap was cruising on the streets of Leeds, and he saw this boy in a dark doorway, right? The Gaudy Boy, right? And he describes him as afflicted with joy. Right, so in a very typical, Arthur Yap way, he can see the ambivalence in the boy, but also expresses his own ambivalence, right, about his own sexuality. So in my poem, Gaudy Boy, I'm addressing this boy in the dark doorway that Arthur describes. Gaudy Boy, because you smell good, because you spell éclat as tear to pieces, because gaudy means originally delightful, as in annual college feast, British, the largest ornamental bead in a rosary, a jest. Or else it means a yellow dye from dyer's rocket. Because in your turnout, one cold night in Leeds, Arthur pricks you out, and in the moon's half-light, in fear of the year of night, and of the eye of day, but mostly of the cellar of your heart, cold scuttle. And we who think we are in the clear, fiercely free of prayer, smell, and fear, we who justify ourselves, dare to take pity on you, soluble crossword puzzle. We read the Times and Arthur in party-colored dress, and oh yes, oh well, the joke has always been on us.
Say a little bit about the joke has always been on us. I'm always struck by that last line there.
Yeah, I, am reflecting upon, I guess the ambivalence of both the Gaudy Boy as well as Arthur Yap in coming out as gay men, and distinguishing, I guess, between them and myself and others like myself who are now fiercely free, who are
Fiercely
out and
free, yeah.
proud. And, there's of course great delight and great power in being out and proud. But at the same time, sometimes we may find ourselves looking back in contempt at our earlier selves that are not so out, or others who are in that ambivalent, twilight, shall we say. And then we discover that those of us who are fiercely out are really not so free after all. I mean, because after all, society is still very largely homophobic, right? And what appears as freedom sometimes, we enacting on our freedom, we run up against, right, things that are free within ourselves, because there are things that are fixed in ourselves, that are past, that our family has fixed in ourselves, that we're not totally free. And so in that sense, of course, the joke is on us. We're not as free as we think we are.
Yeah, and even this idea of freedom can be pushed too far, can't it, if you're not careful? That you can sort of think, I must be free in every way, which becomes weirdly a new kind of imprisonment. But yeah, and it makes you want to look back at Arthur Yap's poetry, which is presumably part of your intention, this sort of dialogue across time to people in many ways who haven't been as fortunate, a year in Leeds is quite different from time in Oxford. Anyway, let's go on. I want to talk to you about, I've been to Leeds. I want to talk to you about ungovernable bodies, the sequence of, I think these are your most erotic poems. I'm afraid I'm choosing the most vanilla of the set, but these are your most erotic, but a lovely sequence of poems, all in sonnet form. I thought you'd perhaps talk a little bit about, because this for me goes back to the Pillow Book and this sense of, it feels again a bit like an extension of the Pillow Book almost. It feels like a little mini Pillow Book, very willing to be very detailed, very specific, but not heavy-handed, slightly light, but also sort of a yearning for something deeper. Very, very much the atmosphere that I really first read in the Pillow Book. Perhaps you'd say a little bit about ungovernable bodies. I really like that title as well, because all of our bodies are ungovernable, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. This is the other side of freedom, isn't it? That we cannot control it, right? Our bodies are ungovernable. I mean, it is very, very, I think, acute of you to actually link this to the Pillow Book, all right? Because, this sequence is actually ungovernable bodies, which I'm still working on. So I published, a number of them in Inspector, but it's an ongoing sequence. So this sequence is actually based on a sex diary that I kept in my 30s. And that was when, of course, I first arrived in New York City, and I was out and about, right? Learning, more about the city and about the bodies that it has. So every one of these sonnets is prefaced by by a diary entry, as an actual diary entry in the book. And the language there can be, to some people may come across as rather crude, or to other people might come across as rather clinical. But to me, what is so interesting is actually the contrast between that very sexually explicit language and the language of the sonnets, right? And I think, again, is that tension, right, between two different languages, two different forms that really interest me so much, that I want to continue writing these ungovernable bodies. So the one I'm going to read for you is called Carlos. And the diary entry goes like this. Carlos, November 30, 2006, Thursday. Met again at Splash Bar, back in my place, 69 Protard. And when I first shared this poem with some friends, did not know, of course, some of these terms. What is 69? What is montage? Somebody thought it was the particular art technique, which is also correct, all right. But it speaks about sexual codes, right? We have all kinds of codes in speaking to one another, and you have to know the code in order to understand. And there's a kind of playfulness about thinking about poetry as a kind of code as well. Yeah, that you want in, not out. Yeah. A bedroom is not a bedroom unless it has a means of egress, says the rules for sellers. After the larks have sung, our Romeo must have a system for leaving safely and secretly. It is only after marrying that our lovers find, at one tragic finish, one another in a tomb. A bedroom is not a bedroom unless it has a means of egress, says the rules for buyers. Outside my room in Queens, a fire escape for lovers who found their way to my bed. Staring at its black, complicated extensions, I wrote my earliest American poems about freedom and happiness, misery and desire. The night train frothing on a nearby track.
That's great. I think this is could be almost emblematic of such a deep theme in your work. This is sort of erotic theme, and how I read it is just you're unwilling to be coy. You're trying to call a spade, calling a 69 a 69. You just want to be quite frank about it, quite straightforward about it. And as you said, it's lovely, the diary entry sort of contesting with the sonnet form, which is, or the sonnet is always a rather educated form, isn't it? It's also a rather literary form. It's a written form. It's not like a villanelle that's a spoken form, or originally a spoken form. One does slightly feel a bit jealous of your sexual diary. If I based my poems on my sexual diary, I wouldn't have much of a sequence to go with. Anyway, let's draw a curtain across that, and I want to then go on to another sequence of yours, which is Inspector. No, I don't. I want to go to I want to go to this sequence of poems that you've written about people who've left Singapore, like yourself. I wonder whether a simple history of Singaporeans in America, the history is far from simple, so that word is placed there, I think, ironically. Say a little bit about that sequence, and then we'll hear this striking poem, The Columnist.
Thank you. I took the term a simple history, in fact, from Henry James, The Portrait of Lady. All right, where he calls his novel a simple history, and so therefore to my mind it is history, but it's also fictionalized, not in the sense of me falsifying these interviews which I had with these various Singaporeans who have given me permission, who basically told me their stories of migration, but also have given me permission to write my poems based on the stories that they told. The fictional aspect, of course, of writing these poems is that I am acknowledging that I'm not transcribing literally what they're saying. That what they said must necessarily undergo some kind of transmutation, change, transformation, in order to become a poem. Right? So it's really a kind of like heads up, like this is as much my story of their lives as it is their stories of their lives. It's like a kind of collaboration, shall we say, between interviewer and interviewee that actually resulted in these poems. So I started by, of course, interviewing my friends in New York City, people who I know, who might give me permission to talk to them. And one of my closest friends in New York City is a woman called Wee Hong Ling, who has a fascinating story about how she came to New York and why she stayed and what she found in staying in New York. So I will read for you this poem written for her called The Ceramicist. The Ceramicist. On a NASA scholarship to map the world, she walked into a... Oh, hang on. You wanted me to read The Columnist instead, didn't you?
Yes, I'm happy with the Ceramicist as well. I like that one. They're your poems, Jee.
Well, which one? It's up to you.
Let's go for the
I don't think we
Columnist.
have time for both.
We haven't got
Okay,
time
let's
for
go
both,
for The
unfortunately.
Columnist.
That's good. But it's great to have the introduction to the other one, because that'll get everyone to buy the book and read the other one as well. Read the Ceramicist.
Yes,
We should have planned that.
that's funny. Well, I will read The Columnist. Thanks for asking me to read that. And that is also written for a friend called Kopin Tan. And what is, quite exceptional in his case was that Kopin actually renounced his Singapore citizenship in 2018. So the poem is very much about why he decided to give up his Singapore citizenship and retain his American one. The Columnist. The questionnaire required him to rank his top 3 reasons: children's education, property prices, NS, CPF. Thinking the answers only acronyms for the good life defined by Singapore, he chose to write next to the label, others. He could have said he was the very first gay Asian columnist for Barron's, with tens of thousands of followers, death threats for dumping on the casinos, and he threw over the stock market for his novel. Or more facetiously, he could have said he liked Tate's cookies, or more tellingly, the pictures of his SG friends and wives. But when he posted on Facebook holiday snaps of his husband, deafening silence. They liked his cheesecake photos well enough. They did not like the pics of Tom and him. Being an aspiring writer, he could have added a grace note of that special time, his teens, nose in the swimming pool library. He read about sex in the changing room. Another swimming pool in an elite school floated to mind. Also the swimming trunks suspended at the back of the classroom to dry. Hearing him speak, I saw again the wing-cowering, petroleum-covered birds. What made the younger female teachers blush? The trunks spoke volumes. He, the willing scribe, could just outline their bios in this form, enough to rub some noses in the pews. Or else, he could have added, for the record, before reason number 1, before 0. He was a block away from World Trade Center, doing an interview with some big shot in Marriott's room 1703, when the first tower chased a falling man down to the ground, and everything the dust covered turned white. Sprinting down, he was out on the street to cover the event, following his reporter's nose. Bodies, or what could be identified as bodies, leached the lifeblood from his face. Strangers stripped their dress shirts off for masks and doused them from bottles given free by hot dog vendors. The smoldering smell persisted on Wall Street more than a month later. Once in a while, the subway car would hear a cry and stop. He bonded with his city then, therefore, reading his article, a hymn of love, a declaration, a new constitution drawn up and ratified by meeting Tom, in therapy, the bar, not the shrink, and marrying in New York City Hall. He could have said gaily, and that is why I'm turning in my passport and IC. One long expired, but the other not. And what he declared would have been a lie. It would not have taken into account the sad little bar squatting at the top of Lucky Plaza, where men fell each night into their drinks and could no way be dried. The lonely hours of driving in a shell where was no standing up or lying down, but offered escape still. No questions asked, but Whitney's "Don't You Wanna Dance With Me" on Nicole Drive, which ran beside the coast, but wrote and rewrote oh, number and letter. Because of those drowned mouths, he was to write for his one reason on the questionnaire, the criminalization of homo, quantified those hours as 377 and graded his own answer with an A.
I think that's a wonderful poem, G. It's a history poem, isn't it? Really, it's a sort of history poem that takes in, the whole. Well, there's so much of that. Well, as you said, the criminalization of homo, and then the ellipses, but also the World Trade Center. This whole change from one life to another, which I've never experienced. And one of the things you're doing in this sequence, it seems to me, is empathizing. You've had that experience yourself, but many of us, I come from a small town in England, and I just moved down the road to London. It's about as far as I've ever gone. But you've changed culture, you've changed worlds, you've changed languages. So much so that you're writing in English. Perhaps you could say a bit more about that sort of change, because I know it's been a deep part of your life, and this sequence it's a deep part of so many people's lives, and always has been really, all the way through history, immigrations. That's what the world is really. But perhaps there's something more you could say about that.
Yeah, no, thanks for inviting me to say it. I think, movements can be big and small, but they can be still be very significant, isn't it? And could be very intense. I'm just thinking like, even if we move from one neighborhood to the next neighborhood, they could be completely different culture, could have completely different cultural milieu. Certainly, I think, this sequence of poems, a simple history of Singaporeans in America, I wrote them because I really also wanted to challenge myself, and not always to be writing about just me and lyrically. So these poems actually forced me to write about others with all the responsibility that entails. Because, when you're writing about yourself, you can very well write about anything you want, right? Because you're only responsible for yourself. But if I'm trying to capture somebody's story, there is a great deal of responsibility in doing so. And also, I also wanted to try writing a narrative. So you mentioned, of course, how these poems are very historically dense. They are filled with historical references. And they have to be because they are stories. And I really wondered how I would fare if I try to handle a more narrative form, right, instead of a more lyrical form like the sonnet. And so that's been a very interesting, experience for me because as I'm interviewing these, friends or associates or strangers turned friends for their stories, I actually write down longhand. I'm not taping them because I find that the slowness of it forces me to already select what I'm writing down. So I'm not overwhelmed by all the information and detail that come with a life naturally, but I'm already listening out for the patterns, for the key details, that would actually find their way into a poem. So for the poem that I just read, The Columnist, of course, what intrigued me most was that irrevocable decision, right, to give up one's citizenship, right, and why Copen chose to do so. But also, by writing, poems about other Singaporeans who are now living in America, I realized too, how different we all are. Everybody has such a different reason for moving and for staying, and they have very different feelings now about Singapore or about New York. So whereas, on the one hand, Corbyn, has decided to give up his association with Singapore, there are other Singaporeans in New York City who find themselves, even feeling even more loyal and bonded to the country than before. Right? So that's very, very interesting to me because all these forms a kind of comparison and contrast from my own story.
So what we'll do, I think, is let's just jump across to the next poem, and then we can see how we go. Yeah.
Yep, sure. Let's do that.
So yeah, the other thing I wanted to, you call this collection Inspector, Inspector, a very striking cover. I always notice that you don't use a comma, but um, and then you've got this sequence of prose poems again, which for me relates back to the Pillow Book. I don't know why I keep on relating everything, but that prose poem form, which is very, very strong in the Pillow Graphic, and the prose poem has got a particular strength. And this seems to me to be your COVID diary, as it were, your kind of your response to COVID. I think everybody started if they weren't writing before COVID, they were writing in COVID. I would imagine nearly all poetry magazines have got a backlog of COVID poems to read because it's such a historic event, wasn't it? Suddenly one was in the midst of a poem. But let's just read the first. It's a set of prose poems, including the Zoom background. But let's hear the first one, the Goldfish Bowl.
Sure. I was afraid you're going to call it a COVID poem.
Yeah.
Precisely because everyone is writing COVID poems.
Yes, that's right, yeah, that's right.
But I mean, I'm just joking, of course. I mean, if I just say a few words about, the title of the book, as well as the title of this sequence, Inspector, Inspector, and why there isn't a comma between the two words.
Everybody's been waiting for that answer. No one can relax until they hear about that comma.
Because you do not put a comma between somebody's job title and their last name. So, for example, you would not put a comma between Inspector and Moss. Inspector Moss, right? So this is an inspector whose last name is Inspector. And the reason, of course, is that it's a singularity of both role and person, right? He is inspector both by name as well as by virtue of his job, right? So that was anyway kind of like a cute thing that I wanted to do, and of course, the sequence itself, which is, as you said, a sequence of prose poems, have various kinds of inspectors appearing in them in a kind of surreal way, because after all, the pandemic has been a very surreal experience for all of us, isn't it? In so many ways. And for me, why this series found its way into Inspector, Inspector the book is because, of course, I was also thinking about the death of my father in the midst of all the destruction wrought by the pandemic. So I was trying also to put my own personal loss in the context of these wider losses. Yeah. So I'll read for you, the Goldfish Bowl, which introduces the entire sequence. The Goldfish Bowl, supposedly a show of support for medical workers, the banging on pots and pans at exactly 5 p.m. every day, is to scare off the demons. Listen to the hysteria detonating like Chinese firecrackers just beneath the grimness. You can hear it also on the liberal internet. It has the sadness of dead goldfish floating to the top of the Goldfish Bowl, or bodies in body bags stacked into refrigerated trucks outside a hospital. Masked up, one health inspector says to another. I can't breathe, says the black man, locked down by a beast with 6 knees and hands. I should take to the streets, I say, but what if I catch the virus? I will write instead, in the privacy of 5 a.m., banging my pot against my pan in this way.
It's this sort of, again, another theme in your writing is the matter of writing, isn't it, itself? Um, and therefore, by implication, the finding of a voice, um, the, the desire to say something that's true, and so on. I wonder whether you could say something about writing itself and what writing has come to mean to you.
Yes. That's a really, really, important question for me that I've been asking myself. I think, in Steep Tea, which was published in 2015, so that was like 7 years ago. The key poem in that book, Steep Tea, about writing is the poem Attribution, right?
Mm.
And the poem Attribution is about the time at Oxford when I, plagiarized, some books, some authors, right, in a paper that I wrote for my tutor. And I use that as a kind of metaphor for thinking about how post-colonial writers very often feel as if they are imitating, right, the canon, the tradition, that they don't have something original to contribute. Because after all, the material they're using, the English language, is not originally theirs. I think so. Steep T kind of, was thinking about that relationship with language, which I think I have moved. I wouldn't say beyond. I don't think you can ever get beyond that issue, but I have moved on to think about much more about my relationship as a writer, not so much to the English language, but my relationship as a writer to the world, right?
Mm.
So, what do I do? I mean, why am I not out there, marching? What excuse do I have for not being out there marching against, these blatant instances of injustice that we see around them, right? What right do I have to stay in my little cocoon and write? How do I justify the act of writing if it's justifiable at all? So I think the sequence Inspector Inspector, but also the entire book itself, struggles with that. I think question, and I think the question will occupy me for quite a while, because obviously I don't think there is a definite answer or endpoint to the questioning. But I think it is important for us as writers to ask ourselves that question constantly.
Indeed, and we're going to come to this final poem of the collection just now, which because in the reply, which is your reply to these all this whole sequence of poems in your father's voice, your reply to him. Again, there's this sort of question, concern, unease about writing, especially about writing poetry, and the distance that poetry seems to have from your father and your father's life concerns. As you say, you grew up in a two-bedroom flat, with your grandfather, and with your father's needs very, very different. And there's you trying to understand yourself in relationship to him. I wonder whether you just might say something about this final, quite long, I think it's the longest poem in the collection. It feels quite a strict poem. To me, it feels like a poem. This is you writing a major poem, a sort of. It's very striking. It's a final poem of the collection. It wants to be a final kind of statement, almost, even if it's cut through with ambivalences, of which there are many. And I'm struck that we get back to Mount Faber, that we started. And this time we have you and your dad on the bike going down the road next to Mount Faber. In my mind, I picture that very vividly, and in the poem, I see that very vividly. Although, of course, I've never been there. One of the wonders about poetry at its best is I start to feel when I read you that I grew up in Singapore. That's the whole point, isn't it? That the writer reaches across to you and shows you their life without judgment, without moralizing, without condemning other lives, but means that you sort of start to feel like you've lived that life as well. So perhaps say something about this long poem that you finished the collection.
Yeah. No, I mean what you just said about feeling as if you know Singapore now through my work is the best compliment a non-Singaporean reader of my work could pay me. So thank you. I really appreciate that, and for noticing, the recurring motifs in my work, such as, Mount Faber. Definitely, as I said, it's a mountain that looms right in my imagination, even though it's a tiny hill, really. um, I think, as you said, the reply is very deliberately placed at the very end of his collection as the reply of the son to the father. Once the voice of the father, falls silent in the palinodes, once the palinodes come to an end. But I'm also thinking that it is also a kind of continuation of my work on a simple history of Singaporeans in America, right? Because it also uses a narrative form, and it also uses a very loose iambic pentameter. I now remember what we were talking about before we lost each other for a while. You were talking about how some of the poems in simple history reminds you of epic poetry, right?
Yes,
Because
that's right. Oh, that's right. Yeah.
right. And that's so interesting, a point. I wasn't thinking of Milton so much as perhaps Wordsworth, and perhaps even more because, an older reference would actually be Chaucer. I'm thinking about the Canterbury Tales, right? It's the
Oh,
beginnings
yes,
of
of course.
iambic pentameter, right? I mean, Chaucer's pilgrims, of course, made their way to Canterbury, telling stories to one another. In the same way, I hope my little band of Singaporeans, right, in their pilgrimage, in their migration from Singapore to New York, are also able to share their stories with one another, right, and prove to be entertaining as well. So yeah, so that I think writing that series actually honed the kind of muscles I need, develop the kind of muscles that I need to actually write the reply, which is longer than any of the other earlier poems. Shall I read it for you?
Yes, indeed, do, yeah.
The reply. You are silent now, and it's no surprise you have been a silent movie all my life. That's poetry's way of putting it, and it's dead wrong. You're no chaplain, funny and glamorous, although you may be one of the many minions in Metropolis. No, you're not the proof for a thesis. My earliest memory is riding on your shoulders, heading home from the merry-go-round. My last memory of you living, your lung walls succumbing to the flooding, is the speechless and tearless hospital bed, and me planting a kiss on your forehead. Between these short clips, you bicycling down the gentle swerve of road that hugs the bottom slope of Mount Faber like a rug. Me sitting with my pianica on the top tube, legs slightly raised to free the circling paddles. We're a home movie that nobody wants to watch, except the family, the ones knowing, sentimental, disputatious. Your four brothers rich with arrogance, your two sisters hard as stale biscuits, expect you to agree with them, and you do, backpedaling as you do. That's the rub. I see it, and judge it craven of you. Not seeing then, I am your best reply. What with my school honors and eventually my scholarship to go overseas. While mother hogs the weekly phone calls, with talk of winter clothes and shopping malls, your silence grows and grows on me, profound as the first snow falling on college grounds. At the end of time, 3 long exciting years, out of Heathrow mother and you appear, and I'm shocked to see the snow in your hair. Loveliest of trees, the cherry now, is hung with bloom along the bough. To my flowering regret, you've flown the distance, but I deny you the pomp and circumstance. Thinking myself above empty ceremonies, and you and mother below the Latin service, I don't sign up for the Sheldonian show, but throw together an improvised shoot of us in the college garden, me geared up and you gamely following this young poet. Not a word of reproach, not a subtitle. My Joe pays off his Pip's unpaid bills. You won't know the reference, but you would like Joe, both of you working men. He a blacksmith and you an electrician. Both of you surviving shits for fathers with your goodness intact, saving dicks for sons with your belief in the best of lucks. There I go again, showing off my learning and irreverence. There I go again, poetry. I'm still answering my aunts and dear uncles who are dying, dead, or softening to the middle of their heads. It's worsening since living in New York. I've written book after book after book and placed them like bombs in your hands. You keep them carefully by your Bible in the high drawer of the TV cabinet, the cheek by the turn your other cheek. Where is strength? Where is weakness? What is truly evil? What is goodness? The freedom fighters, someone's terrorist, someone's draft dodger, the pacifist. This week, my 11s read the Oedipus, and like all generations, were nonplussed by the enormities wrought by right intent, fleeing father murder to father murder, abjuring mother sex to sleep with her. If to save a baby is to kill all babies through the lightning plague in the city, what should we do with the mewling mess, milk-stained, exposed, ankle-torn, on the green wooded slopes of Kithawan? There are some places like Singapore that would make the careful calculation. There are some places like Greece once that would pose the question, and no more. You, my father, are the Grecian oracle. There I go again. This habit of reading life as if it's a work of art. This tendency grows from the library books devoured tenderly on the walk home, while avoiding the lances thrusting up like lampposts. And you encourage me, give me courage, when at the book's corner you leave me and shop with mother for life at OG. You show me, as an unschooled man's aider, you are replaceable and irreplaceable. At your wake, attended by relatives and a number of poet friends, I give the reply of the living to the dead. For you looking oddly like bread in the yellowing husk of your body, the eulogy begins with a bicycle, and it says, I remember, just that. All the carefully chosen phrases reducible to one refrain. But a letter is not a eulogy. It has much more of me in it, and at last, much more of you, my father, in me. When you're loaded into the oven, to lift from us the annual burden of visiting and sweeping your grave, I'm seized by a wild desire to swear that before every poetry reading, I'll say, I'm Koh Jee Leong, the son of Koh Dat Se, in the manner of the Malays and the Scots. The desire passes. Let this be the brother, the guilty brother to the dead and gone. The reply, a replacement for other ones. The movie you and I together caught. The son you have, for the sons you have known.
That's great. Thank you very, very much, Jee. It's a shame we couldn't hear all the palinodes that go before that, but it's just so lovely to conclude our sort of exploration of your poetry, at least since the Pillow Book, and at least in English. It's lovely to be able to look back to the Pillow Book, look back to your first Carcanet collection, Steep Tea, and then look at your new collection, Inspector, Inspector, and find out about the missing comma. So really, really good to meet you, Jee. I really hope that if you come to London, we can we can do one of these in person. But I hope that today's exploration of your work, and there's much more we could have said, isn't there? And there's much more poems that I would have liked to hear. I had to keep on thinking, oh no, we can't do that one as well. We didn't have time. But really, really good to meet you. So yeah, really good to hear your poetry. So thank you very much for coming to Poetry East, at least online. It's just a shame that it can't be here in the London Buddhist Centre.
No, thank you so much. I really, really do appreciate how you've actually followed my work, through the books. I really do appreciate the connections that you make between different poems, and different parts of my work, and, for being so generous in listening to me talking on and on and on about it. I always think, that the best part of a writer is, put into their work. So, this is like the not so good part. And so I hope, whatever answers I have given, in their stumbles, in their vagueness, will, still, I guess, make some difference, in terms of, understanding the work.
I'm sure it will reach out to many, many people. Thank you very, very much. Thank you indeed. Yeah, yeah. Yes.